Welcome to our second session on the political unconscious. Conrad's not able to make it today, but I'm very happy to just sort of open the floor for a general discussion. I now realize that 45 pages a week in the political unconscious is not a small amount. As you gathered, this is yeah, it's a dense text. I appreciate Connor's sharing of the recent plenary that was hosted by Robert Talley, featuring a lot of Jameson scholars. I don't know if anyone saw that on YouTube, uh, because Fred himself reflected on the legacy of the text, and it was very interesting to hear that as I was explaining last time about The Hidden God by Goldman, that in fact, one of the deadlocks that literary criticism, according to Jameson, was trying to transcend was precisely this expressive causality of Goldman, knowing full well that Goldman's entire project was extremely meritorious and of extreme interest and very useful. But that combined with an effort, which again is very much of a French a problem in the sense that we run into this with Deleuze and Guattari. And you'll notice that there's a footnote in the section that we read where Jameson recognizes that we should be very careful when applying this molecular, molar sort of dichotomy that Deleuze and Guattari work with. Why? Well, precisely because they're dealing with a centralized French Communist Party that is of a established nature, which in the U.S., the problem Jameson recognizes is like the opposite from the standpoint of collectivity, of political solidarity. So therefore, this suspicion or this sort of hesitation that Deleuze and Guattari have about centralized power in the United States actually resonates very differently. But that doesn't sort of preclude Jameson from entering into a very interesting conversation about how Deleuze and Guattari also think totality, which we will get to. So, uh, after the discussion about the way that structural causality in Althusser's sense, and I just want to review what exactly we mean by structural causality. Uh, After the conversation at about pages 40 through 47 about how we still can retain a theory of mediation, because one of the big challenges would be that if structural causality is the new modus operandi of dialectics, are we thinking the various spheres of a social formation such that each sphere is almost incommensurable to itself? Or are we running into a problem whereby we have an understanding of a social formation, or in this case, of a text, right? But I think we can conceive of social formation also in an abstract way as a philosophy of history, um, as a pure reign of difference, as a pure metonymy, right? In that case, this notion of the Marxist idea of representation as Vorstellung becomes extremely important when we're thinking about an analysis of a given social formation, in the sense that a Vorstellung is a kind of active present object. It's an objectification of an overdetermined series of contradictions that make up a given situation, right? Or a localized situation. And that objectification of a point of contradiction becomes almost like a localized example of what Jameson will call totality. And I think it's very useful. I myself have had the chance to read these big books that are at the background of these bigger debates about totality. And what are these books? If you haven't read them, we should throw them onto the table, both for your own personal bibliography that you should read in the future. But first is what's called The Critique of Dialectical Reason by Jean-Paul Sartre. Second is History and Class Consciousness by Lukács. Of course, History and Class Consciousness comes first, 1923. Critique of Dialectical Reason comes after Being and Nothingness. And this is famously, as you saw in my interview with Terry Pinkard, the book that Sartre wrote after he read The Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, what is going on in, let's first talk about Sartre's effort as it pertains to the definition or to the meaning of totality. Okay. In this text, what we get is the conception of totality as a theory of groups in such a way that groups inhabit what Sartre calls a kind of inert totality. And the struggle of groups is the capacity for the impossibility of inhabiting a full totality. So this idea of a kind of, the moment in which all cows are gray, or sort of like this achievement of absolute knowing on behalf of a given group, is totally foreclosed. It's foreclosed except in moments of revolutionary rupture. And this is what Sartre refers to as the fused group. Okay. It's a very important concept, which is elaborated in the section of the book dealing with the French Revolution, which is a very famous section of the book, very influential section of the book. And the basic idea is that groups touch a contradictory totality, a logic of society, a logic of the system, which is only available in fleeting moments. And in those moments that are fleeting, they grasp the human. They grasp something that is otherwise unavailable to them. They then seek to concretize that object, but it doesn't last because social life is subordinated to what Sartre develops as seriality. So there's a kind of inertia to social bonds. So ultimately, he's thinking totality as this. I always kind of like to think that Sartre's critique of dialectical reason is a bit like Freud's group psychology in a certain way. It's a theory of groups. But the big point being is that there exists a kind of caricature or a sort of false reading of totality out of the Marxist Hegelian tradition that Jameson wants to clarify as not even present in Hegel. Okay. So that's the critique of dialectical reason and totality. Totality is not something that is necessarily possible except in these fleeting moments of the fused group. And then, of course, by the way, they create a bond which is based on a logic of persecution, by the way, and they create almost like a mini social contract. It's a very fascinating analysis that Sartre puts forward. Now, what is totality for Lukács in History and Class Consciousness? A couple points. First off, it's for Lukács, and this I think is essential, it's not the primacy of economic motives of a historical conjuncture that constitutes the decisive difference between Marxism and bourgeois science, but it is the point of view of totality. So again, just like Jean-Paul Sartre, Lukács is thinking totality as it is instantiated or concretized in a moment of group consciousness, right? However fleeting that moment may be. Now, the difference between the two is that Lukács is offering a far more epistemological conception of totality, flirting with a kind of neo-Kantianism, which many of his critics say that he can never fully extinguish. And by neo-Kantianism, all we mean is that something like the identity of the subject and the object is made possible. That technically makes Lukács beyond neo-Kantianism. That puts him in the realm of what people call a kind of naive or idealist version of Hegel. But when was History and Class Consciousness written? 1923. I don't know if you knew this, but Lukács revises and abandons this idea of the possibility of the identical subject-object. When? Does anybody know when he does this? Or why he does this? Why he abandons? It's very interesting for us. It's when he reads the 1844 political and economic manuscripts, which were only available in the 30s. Because in those texts, and Jameson makes a footnote about this, in those texts of Marx, the whole conception of Hegelian objectification is basically is made problematic. This is not the best way in which we understand dialectical reconciliation. So he sort of moves away from this conception, while at the same time never abandoning this idea that the proletarians' sort of yearning or position in capitalism why does totality matter? It also matters in part, not purely as a kind of achieved rational point of knowledge of the system or a kind of pedagogical or praxis oriented achievement, but it's also a psychological problem. In what sense? Precisely because reification. And what is reification? Reification is the fragmentation of psychic reality brought on by systems of advanced modernity, technological bureaucracy, modes of rationalization, the whole theory of instrumentalized reason from Max Weber, etc. Right? So reification is a concept from Marx that is then thought through Weber's conception of the alienation brought on by instrumentalized reason. And this is exactly where, by the way, psychoanalysis enters into the picture with Lukács, in the sense that psychoanalysis is also trying to get at the problem of psychic fragmentation. And moreover, psychoanalysis is trying to historicize modes of psychic fragmentation and ways that psychic fragmentation evolve or mutate, right, into an achieved, what he calls libidinal transfiguration. Libidinal transfiguration. It's very Blakean. Northrop Frye's theory of the archetypes are huge for Jameson. And what he's doing here is very much influenced by Norman O'Brien, Life Against Death, one of the great, American Marxist Freudian texts where we get a allegorical conception of the death drive historicized. If you've ever read the text, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. Right? And what actually is this about? Well, this is about a collective consciousness of liberation, right? In a moment instantiated through consciousness, but now with psychoanalysis, we have a theory of libido. So we have a theory of the body, which Hegelianism doesn't quite have. So we're linking Marx, Hegel, and Freud theoretically into a much more robust conception of the group. Again, we're going back to the group. And what's beautiful, I think, about this point is that in Jameson's recent reflections on the political unconscious, this is exactly the kind of stuff that he said is the reason that he wrote the book, to the political unconscious itself, right? Because while the political unconscious is understood as this kind of like uh, collapse in a given structure of meaning, a collapse whereby the political is overloaded with contradictions, and kind of the reader faces the inevitability of the political, okay, in the last instance. And here, Graymoss's notion of the semiotic rectangle is a perfect illustration of that, precisely because moments that can reveal what he calls ideological closure are moments in which the political unconscious becomes available to us, right? Moments in which the political almost is like undeniable or is so palpable that it cannot be contained. Because here we have another very, I think, useful concept, although it's a bit elusive, which is called strategies of containment. Strategies of containment. What exactly is a strategy of containment? Well, a strategy of containment, as I read it, would be something like the following, which is within a given social formation and its relationship to a mode of production. You have an overdetermined field of contradictions on the one hand, but a strategy of containment is a way in which you sort of cohere a resolution that is coherent on its own terms, but not inclusive of the totality of those contradictions, which itself would be almost like an impossibility. So therefore, strategies of containment is very close to Jameson's later aesthetic geographical concept of cognitive mapping, insofar as cognitive mapping is about this idea, which he always associates with conspiracy, right? This idea that late capitalism only permits, no longer is this Lukácsian notion or even this Sartrean notion of a kind of realized total relation of knowledge to the social totality really what's going on in criticism. but rather there are these kind of like strategies of almost like finite knowing of the totality, which ultimately reveal that knowing to be almost like false or sort of like a simulacra or a conspiracy. Um, that has something to do with the way that space is fragmented even more in late capitalism and finance capitalism. And that's kind of later Jameson. We're not quite there yet. Um, but anyways, but that is something to keep note of. So yes, so the idea then would be that um, totality remains this problem, which, by the way, Jameson says, who is he sort of polemicizing against in this whole debate with totality? Well, he's polemicizing against Lyotard and Baudrillard and Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari. Lyotard says that totality is the great enemy that has to be extinguished. And on the one hand, on the other hand, I think Jameson is saying that, well, if we extinguish this premise that something like totality is a dialectical logic that we should in fact use as critics, use as philosophers, and so on. Um, what do we miss if we don't have a commitment? We miss a theory of mediation, a theory of mediation. And here, mediation is, I think, a very important background concept in the sense that um, before he has this idea of postmodernism, which Anna Kornblue, by the way, Anna Kornblue has written a very good book on immediacy. I think I will invite her to be one of our guest speakers when we're done reading this book, by the way. I think it would be good because she's a Jameson scholar. And I also had a conversation with Anna about the theory of mediation in Jameson, but we also discussed a really good essay that kind of dovetails with this thing that I was elucidating a moment ago about psychoanalysis. You notice that Jameson makes this point whereby internal to the socialist tradition, the revolutionary tradition, there are sort of two modalities of thinking libidinal transfiguration. There is the kind of Wilhelm Reich model, which is this sort of fusional model in which libidinal energies have a kind of ecstasy, a kind of Dionysian unity is possible of the community. And there is a kind of excessive or a joyful, this is like the point at which a revolutionary libidinal moment is possible and realized in history. And this is sort of the aim of the community. The aim of the community is to achieve such moments of catharsis. Yeah. But then Jameson says there's a completely other modality which pushes against this Dionysian. And what does he refer to that as? Well, he refers to it as Leninist, actually. And it's here where he invokes Lenin's funny, I think, funny example of, this comment about Lenin and revolutionaries listening to fine music, right? In other words, he thinks that Leninism itself is a restraint, almost austere not in economics, but austere in terms of desire and enjoyment. That it's like the revolutionary should be restrained. But he says that this schism marks psychoanalysis. And it is psychoanalysis sort of allows us to map that difference back onto the left. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Mark Fisher's wonderful elaboration of all of this in his later work called Acid Communism, and his theory of the two lefts, which I've written about and I think others are aware of as well. So I found that quite compelling, all of that commentary on psychoanalysis. I don't know about you guys. I also found it compelling that Jameson, as it pertains to totality, makes a claim that even Marxism, and here is another example of this funny slippage whereby Jameson can sound like an orthodox Marxist at times, What does he say about the 18th of Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the text by Marx? Well, he says, here's a good way to understand totality within the text, which is the inadequacy of the petty bourgeois position as the story of the text unfurls, right, is revealed precisely in the way that the petty bourgeois is not capable of inhabiting the totality. And what does that mean? It means that the inhabitation of the totality is a position in which the class can relate to the whole of society and therefore transform society in a moment of non-contradiction. That doesn't mean that you have to fetishize that as a perfect, beautiful soul moment. But you see, again, it brings us back to the Lukácsian and the Sartrean point about these momentary moments of consciousness achieving a non-contradictory point, right? In which social change then is more active, more capable. Yeah. So you could almost think about politics as trying to inhabit this knowledge of these temporary, fleeting moments in which consciousness can gel in a non-contradictory moment, and that then becomes the materiality, literally the materiality of history. The materiality of history is propelled by those moments, despite the fact that those moments are not perfect assemblages or pure assemblages or non-contradictory in total. They're localized. Does this make sense? Right? This is sort of the idea that Jameson is working with. He lists 6 points, which I think still remain very relevant to this day, in what he calls the kind of wider debate in Marxist philosophy between Lukács and Althusser. And I just want to say a point about before I read these 6. Isn't it interesting to me, or isn't it interesting in general, rather, that the Lukács-Althusser rapprochement, it isn't talked about too much. And I feel that perhaps our group could contribute something more to this rapprochement or to this debate. Because according to Jameson, and I think Jameson is a successful thinker precisely because he synthesizes these two. That's one way to understand his success as a Marxist, in my opinion. Okay, so what are these points? He says there's an inevitable overlap in the following categories. That these two thinkers, Lukács and Althusser, coincide problems that are that remain important for us. First, representation, which refers to the theory of narrative itself, the problem of history, the problem of meaning. Representation, that's one. 2, they both think and help us think the collapse in the coherence of social class. Again, one of the very interesting things about Jameson's definition of the 3 concentric circles that towards the end of what we read is introduced as the social, the political, and the political, and what's the third one? Social, political, and I'm forgetting the third one.
Economic.
Is it the economic? Okay, let me pull it up. Historical. The social, political, and the historical. So, what is the social? The social is what constitutes what Jameson calls the diachrony of class struggle itself. That is the social. That's the definition of the social. And he says that Lukács and Althusser both think radically different conceptions of social class. But you see, the point is that even though Jameson is eschewing the inadequacy of the mechanistic Marxist account of social class, precisely because the mechanistic account of social class only privileges the economic and doesn't think overdetermination, and you remember the base superstructure example, right? Well, he's saying that both Lukács and Althusser, and to some extent Sartre, are thinking class precisely as this realized totality and theory of mediation of social groups. We should keep in mind also that for Deleuze and Guattari, and I always think this should be mentioned, there's 2 points of influence of Deleuze and Guattari's Marxism. The first is Althusser himself, structural causality, and the second is the critique of dialectical reason by Sartre. And what they say in Anti-Oedipus that's very important is that what Sartre permits them to think is a new theory of class, no longer tied to class, but tied to a logic of groups. And what I have read, and what I think is one of the disastrous outcomes of the critique of dialectical reason, and Pinkert agrees with me, is that this has given way to an anarchism. It's basically given way to a theory of class as a kind of spontaneity of groups with no material determination per se. Okay. That's another rabbit hole of Deleuze and Guattari I don't want to go down, but we can just say that, flag that as a side point. Okay. The third point of the Lukács Althusser rapprochement is praxis and its relationship to structure. And the problem here revolves around the way that both thinkers allow us to think praxis without falling sway to some humanistic theory of the individual, right? So they think the relationship between class qua structure and praxis, which is where we want to be as Marxists. We don't want to fall into bourgeois humanism, right? We don't want to fall into some personalization of class, okay? Right? Again, the theory of class in Marxism is strategic. The petty bourgeois cannot access totality. And again, we define totality as a moment of the inhabitation of a non-contradictory position and relationship to the social totality. The petty bourgeois cannot do that because they inhabit a contradictory class position, just as the lumpen. Yeah? Number 4, both Lukács and Althusser help us think a theory of time, synchronic and diachronic, specifically through their different theories of historicism and how we transition between one mode of production and the other. The strength of Althusser, according to Jameson, is that Althusser allows us to think overlapping modes of production within one mode of production. And I would even wonder, and I would be curious what Jody Dean would say to this, is the neo-feudal thesis almost kind of like permitted or opened up by Althusser's conception, which we saw graphed last time, of this idea that within a given social formation, you have overlapping modes of production that are contradictory to one another, right? So he thinks that Althusser helps us think the kind of plurality of modes of production, and that gives us a better grasp on historical change across modes of production, right? Fifth, the problem of what is a contradiction. What is a contradiction? And here, how a contradiction is to be made distinct from a model of contradiction based on binary logic. And this then allows Jameson to open up the conversation with Greimas in semiotics. Even though semiotics is non-dialectical, what he's trying to say is that you can use it dialectically because it allows you to analyze a given text, a given social formation, and see its point of ideological closure, and then perform an interpretation at that point, you see. So Lukács is a perfect example of this because Lukács is constantly trying to shrug off the ghost of neo-Kantianism, and neo-Kantianism is based on aporias. It's based on these binary logics, right? Supported by the regulative ideal, right? So you see that's where they both overlap. And then number 6 is in the concept of totality itself, which I've already elaborated. With Althusser, we have structural causality, we have overdetermination. With Lukács, we have a movement away from the identity of subject and object, but towards a thorough commitment throughout the entirety of his career to something like the claim that the proletarian standpoint remains a potentially emancipatory standpoint precisely because of its relationship to knowledge of the social totality and therefore its possibility to transcend reified social forms, right? And it is very interesting that Lukács only wrote one small little essay on Freud, which was very dismissive. I mean, similar to how he was dismissive of like expressionism. because, you know, Lukács had this ethical idea of realism, right? Which is that um, an intellectual or an artist should maintain a virtuous and ethical commitment to realism with full knowledge that the fragmentation brought on by capitalist modernity is so deleterious to collective psychic life, right? So that art should uh, reflect an alternative direction to that, right? And that has gotten him in all kinds of hot water with, as you could imagine, with bourgeois philosophers, no doubt, right? Um, so those 6 points I think are extremely useful. And again, I really found this conversation about Northrop Frye and the archetypes extremely rich. One of the interesting things about that, of course, is the incorporation of allegory and political allegory, and how Jameson's conception of political allegory retains this notion, almost like the flip side or the dark side of the libidinal transfiguration. Political allegory occurs in text, and we'll see this in Balzac through typological characters that represent contradictory class positions, for example. We'll see it in Conrad and other places where the opposite is taking place, right? Where you have and you experience like a complete collapse in the coherence of a sociality, social relations, and so on, right? So it's like exactly what psychoanalysis allows us to see is both of those moments. And he says these are moments in which the master narrative of a given group is revealed as sort of like short-circuited or faulty or something like that, right? And I think this is tied into a theory of tragedy. My personal feeling about the incorporation of Northrop Frye, and I don't know about you all, is that given how Baroque Frye's system is and how elaborate it is, I felt as if Jameson may be adding too many parts onto the machine. Do you know what I mean? Like you kind of have like a car that has all of these like doohickeys and sort of accoutrements. Perhaps we'd have to ask, what are we getting out of Frye, right? But this eclecticism was in the air at the time. I mean, I think that Jameson says at one point that we live in a post-structuralist world, which is an admission, by the way, that his whole desire to retain a commitment to totality will itself be perceived as politically taboo, right? Will itself be perceived as un-PC in a certain way? I think that's actually a question for us, which is, to what extent do we still have cultural pressures on something like an investigation for politics into social totalities? Do you know what I mean? Now that we've kind of tried to bring this concept more down to earth, right? I would say that to some extent this is still very much the case, although Jameson's own reflections on the text in recent years sort of shifted things a little bit differently. And what he was suggesting, which is an interesting point unto itself, is that social breakdown brought on by global climate change and other factors of social dysregulation, crisis, stagflation, austerity, and all of that, post 2008 dynamics, imperialism, have created a problem of immediacy of social forms. And that then becomes the locus of critique. And the question then becomes, and I don't know how much you guys follow academic trends, the academic now tends to say, well, what is critique for after all? Right? Because again, if we return back to this hermeneutic of suspicion, this idea that Jameson starts at the very beginning of the text, which is that Marxism is the story that speaks even in contexts which are alienated to itself. It speaks precisely by revealing something, a hidden logic underneath the system. Well, you know, certain trends that I've talked about on my show and that I think many of you are familiar with in academia are making a move to what's called post-critique, where that model is not privileged, is not seen as useful, in part as a response to the breakdown in society. So that's one thought, but maybe there's another way to get at the problem of totality today. Let me just stop by defining these three very lucid and very clear, and all of these supplementary concepts, you can read about, you can retain, but I think we should definitely retain the three concentric frameworks: the social, the historical, and the political. The social, as I mentioned before, is constitutive diachronically of class struggle and the conflict amongst classes as it appears in texts, right? As it appears in narrative, as it appears, and again, by narrative, we are broad in our conception of narrative, right? So that's concentric framework one. Concentric framework two is the historical, which is the problem of historicizing, right? That is the problem of always historicize, which is what? Which is how can we map things like emplotment or things like the sort of expression of a given text onto a determinant mode of production and social formation, right? And moreover, how is there a dialectical relationship between the two, right? And how can that then give us a greater sense of historical change? Okay, so that's two. Three is what Jameson calls the political. And these are, and this I think is very important apropos these examples we used of libidinal transfiguration and all of that. These are moments of punctual events sequenced over time, right? So that includes a theory also tied to historical, but the political is like a moment, almost you could say almost like of an eruption, right? Of something in a Badgewian sense. It's like what's novel in the world. Like it's like, you know what I mean? It's like that I think is one way to get at what he means by the political. And uh I love this quote on 76 where ideology is introduced to his effort here, where he says, my effort is to track the ideology of a given form as it is transmitted to us by the coexistence of various sign systems, which are traces or anticipations of modes of production, right? Um, and that, by the way, that dialectical relation between a given social formation or mode of production and a political text is what Jameson refers to as political allegory, right? So, so yes, that brings us up to about page 80. Some scattered remarks for you all. Happy to open the floor, and sorry for taking so much time, but I think there might be some chats as well. Please jump in, Andrew.
Yeah, I try to muffle the sound and the background noise, so forgive me if it's a little loud. I'll try to make it quick. But two remarks. Well, one like they're pretty much questions. So I'm tracking the Grama square. I understand how it operates, at least from like the video that you sent, and then like like kind of my own background today. I was doing it, but I guess I'm not tracking in the text what his examples he's specifically using to map out how we could use the Gramus square for these codes or texts or ideologies. So maybe you could like help me elucidate that. But two, I was under the hunch, just like you mentioned, that of course the Gramus square, the semiotic square, is not a dialectical tool, but how he's operating with it to show something dialectical. And I'm wondering if right, so like you have the two contraries, which are the binary logic, and they have within them an embedded contradiction that intersect. And so like just for simplicity, S1 and S2 are contraries, and so the contradiction of S1 was non-S1, and the contradiction of S2 is non-S2. So is it at that point where the two negations meet as contraries? Is that a potential for a dialectical transformation on the part of Jameson that he's trying to operate with this ideological narrative? So that's my question.
Yeah. Well, you know the example I gave from the 18th Brumaire of Marx? You could throw the class formation. Okay, if you could think about it like this. If the petty bourgeois class is incapable of an achieved totality, let's call it achieved totality, that's my phrase, in the sequence of the coup d'état of Louis Bonaparte, on page 166, 167, you sort of get a Gray-Moss square of that, actually. Okay. Right? That shows the position. And so I think social class, the answer would be social class, is one great way in which you can use it. Um, I think it's an excellent way, actually. I think actually it might be a useful exercise for us to even think class formation, this problem of class formation, and apply a Gray-Moss square to issues of class formation in which we can see class positions which do not adhere to the ideological closure of the system, right? Might be one way to think about it, but I will confess I'm still new to the Gray-Moss rectangle or Gray-Moss square. Although the artwork on the cover of the book, and Jameson wrote the foreword to a collection of essays of Gray-Moss. So he's a huge Gray-Mossian, I guess you could say, right? And I think it's quite compelling. I think it's quite compelling to utilize this stuff, and I think that we should, in future sessions, play around with it a little bit more. I know um, there is a certain way in which you're getting a, uh, I guess perhaps Andrew, one of the questions would be, what's the strategic use of? At what point would you need to use it? It would be one question. And I think in the theory of social class, one can see that an analysis of a given conjuncture, right, would lend itself to using it. So that would be my answer to that question. And what was your second point?
Yeah, it was thinking dialectically the Gray-Moss square, like because the two negations at the bottom create a sort of contrary as well. Um, and I'm wondering if, like, in that sense, is Jameson thinking those as a sort of negation of the negation to create like a new sort of because I think if I'm not
Mm,
mistaken, you could create another semiotic square from the original square.
mm,
But I wonder if
mm-hmm.
there's like something sort of narrativizing in this transformation by utilizing that negation. I'm saying negation of the negation because it's two negatives of the contraries that meet at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
And so there's both a necessity and contingency of the square. So something coming out of that for a narrativization for transformation.
Yeah, I invite others to jump in on this. I think this is exactly the kind of navel of the conjuncture is the political unconscious. I think what draws Jameson to the use of this device, this semiotic device, is the way that it reveals the bottoming out of a locus or of a navel, what it called like the navel. I always think of the political unconscious kind of like the navel of the dream in a certain way, and because he does, even though he has this effusive mode of writing that is these elaborate constructive sentences which are seemingly written like high theory meets Jack Kerouac in terms of like this like super spontaneous. It almost feels a little spontaneous, like he's just on a flow, on a tangent. But you notice that he always redefines the political unconscious. I think so far as we've been reading 80 pages, he's defined it 4 or 5 times. Each time is pretty precise. Um, so we'll have to see how the Grey square is introduced to explain uh, uh, a sort of contradictory social constellation of background structural dynamics, right? And the interplay between them, right? I think the interesting thing for us would be how could we find social forms ourselves and sort of play with Grey squares? I don't know if Luis is with us. I know that he has some proclivities in that direction. Um, but yeah, this is something that I'm looking forward to tracking, especially as it pertains to the novels of Balzac, especially after I've recently read one of Balzac's novels. last summer. Um, yeah. So other thoughts? How did people find this section? I know it's a very, very rich and extremely, at times, beautiful set of readings. Frankly, did people find the value of this text, perhaps, in the way that Jameson so effortlessly seams together these huge systems of thought that usually are siloed? I mean, I think that's one of Jameson's great contributions to critical thought is that he unsilos philosophical systems in a very, very uncanny way. It's a very collaborative way. It's a very friendly way. You know, he has this kind of invitation to think, kind of like multiple spinning plates at the same time. Um, he's very much a man after my own intellectual heart in that sense. I've always wanted to aspire to that level of um, synthesizing capacity. You know. Um, Other thoughts, other challenges, other questions that came from this. Please jump in.
Um, yeah, I think the one piece that you quoted a few minutes ago about traces of a past mode of production, or I forget the phrasing, right, but it's essentially looking at a given sign for for the class stamp of ideology that's on it, based on like tracing the historical development of the thesis, essentially, like the kernel. um like specifically, I'm thinking of somebody shared with me this guy, Michael Levins, recently, and he's um like hypothesizing that there are Neoplatonic forms evident in morphological, I'm not sure, science that's frankly a little bit beyond me. But essentially, one main thing that he's arguing is that there are emergent qualities in these various phenomena that are unexplainable by physicalism, which to me seems like a direct avoidance of using the word materialism, even, right? And out of this long piece, there's no mention of dialectics, nor of materialism, nor the word contradiction, not once, right? And so he's going like, oh, well, vulgar or mechanistic materialism is incapable of explaining emergence. And so there are all these complex material phenomena of emergence that are unexplainable except by um, accessing that these scientists must be accessing Neoplatonic forms, and that there's like a the highly refined matter is sort of the substrate through which the signs, or like the matter itself is the sign through which the Neoplatonic form is ingressed into reality. And so he's basically putting forward this massive system of he's trying to explain like idealism encroaching upon the material world, and like, um I'm like, man, we know what emergence is. It's development. It's the dialectical turn. Like, we know that it's a qualitative leap that's produced from quantitative changes. That's what emergence is. Like, Marxism, dialectical materialism has answered that problem that vulgar mechanistic materialism's unable to answer. Um, and so I say all that to say that the class stamp of Levin's and what he's putting forward is evident in the sort of philosophical commitments that are buried on the back half of the sign. So like, that's what the utility of this does for us, is it gives us like a systematic way to invert or turn a sign like over and see both aspects of it, to see each sign as contradictory and pointing in one direction tendency wise in relation to the mode of production or the other, right? It's either trying to put a brake on development and interconnection, And that's the imperialist sort of strategy anyway of fragmentation and underdevelopment, right?
Yeah,
Or it's recognizing the contradictoriness of the totality. And Michael Levins is not
right.
doing that because he's not thinking in dialectics, right? Because he's defending the Platonic form.
I
Check.
see. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's very good. On 82, this moment of the political unconscious, Jameson says, can also be referred to as Althusser's absent cause or as Lacan's real. It's a moment of non-representability in which the text and the pretext kind of dissolve. The distinction between them dissolves, and then the three levels of the social, the political, and the historical are then introduced. After, by the way, he takes us through a long parading proof of the structural study of myth from Claude Levi-Strauss, showing that primitive societies also possess this bottoming out within political myth of the political unconscious itself. Okay. And he basically says, well, if modern reified psychic life, we can study these moments of the breakdown of meaning in these unrepresentable moments through analysis of texts and narratives. This is Levi Strauss shows us this is exactly happening in so-called primitive societies, etc. So that is a very interesting thing if folks have a background in Levi Strauss and wish to elaborate more on this discussion, which happens again from 76 through 80. I'd be more than happy to have you jump in there. I think, though, that this also, by the way, is related to this notion of a symptomal reading. And again, Jameson will say psychoanalysis is sort of the why is psychoanalysis replacing theological hermeneutics? You notice that he says that at one point, because he says the great task as it pertains to hermeneutics, this question of like the meaning, deriving the question of interpretation and meaning and so on. The whole first chapter reading is called On Interpretation. Has to be forged between um, the theological register, which is the richest, the study of the Bible, allegory study of the Bible, and so on, for which Northrop Frye is the best representative of that tradition, by the way, and psychoanalysis. That becomes the rapprochement, right? So when we think mode of production, social forms, consciousness, contradiction, it's Lukács and Althusser. But when we think hermeneutics and the political on the other side of this, like sort of libidinal group point, it is psychoanalysis. So there's a huge adulation and celebration, I think, of psychoanalysis. And by the way, there's a lot of interesting things he says about psychoanalysis that you may find interesting about what Jameson is constantly interested in with psychoanalysis is how you can historicize psychoanalysis as a science itself. In other words, one would have to do some type of Gramscian rectangle or Gramscian square to the hysteric at the turn of the 20th century in order to fully understand how that subjectivity gave Freud the material for the discovery of the unconscious. Such a study would introduce us to the symptomal navel of the historical conjuncture that allowed psychoanalysis to emerge, right? So that I find extremely rich, and there's a lot written about that, and that I find of great interest that we could talk about if folks are interested in that. But again, the title of the essay where Jameson really develops this historicism of psychoanalysis is called Pleasure, a Political Issue, from a collection of essays in the early 2000s called Theories of Ideology. And I did a podcast on it with Anna Kornblue. I highly recommend it if you guys are interested. but again, I do, if folks have any um expertise in Northrop Frye's theory of the archetypes, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on how Jameson is incorporating them, because I really find this notion of libidinal transfiguration. Um, Frankly, I mean, I have actually I'm of a split mind when it comes to this, because I do have that um, sort of criticism of some forms of leftism that are reliant on this idea. You know what I mean? That like revolution is about the maximization of the collective's pleasure. It's this split that we see between like Fourier, right? Where it's like this like is socialist revolution about the maximization of a rational planned society, or is social revolution about a spontaneous and ludic breaking beyond all barriers into some unknown harmony, right? That latter move is very much the Norman O'Brown mystical kind of move, right? Um, yeah, it interests me a great deal. These two. He calls the distinction bodily transfiguration of the perfected community, right? And I think that, he draws the distinction between Reich and Marcuse. Marcuse being the Freudian for libidinal transfiguration of the perfected community. Um, so that's very interesting. Yeah. Let's see. So, uh, other thoughts and questions that have come to you in your reading here. There's also this thing we didn't mention about the ethical, just as an FYI. It's kind of like just briefly, and then we'll go immediately to Andrew and Matilda. The ethical is sort of this presentist mode of criticism which eschews history or the determination of history in literary criticism. And what does Jameson say about ethical criticism, by the way? He says like it's like culturalist, it's very dominant in the academy, and he says that it bottoms out into ressentiment. Because one of the big things, and I talk about this in my Nietzsche book a little bit, I quote Jameson, is that Jameson develops a very, very compelling theory of ressentiment. So there is a wrestling with Nietzsche that we will get to later, by the way. Andrew, please.
Yeah, I'm curious about the polemics against Leotard because, I mean, you mentioned he's a silent critic or a silent polemic in here.
Yeah.
And of course, he'd be more explicit in the capitalist logic
Yeah.
postmodern text. But I'm curious, like, to the extent, like, because Leotard is one of the ones that goes back to Kant and he's
Uh-huh.
privileging the aesthetics and the critique of judgment. But from what I understand, he's like, he's so focused on sensibility that, like, it's so much of representation that it just keeps on extending. And it seems like it forecloses narrative or it
Yeah.
forecloses like something symbolic. So it's like, in a sense, this is the problem of postmodern logic, that the aesthetic is so caught in sensibility that
Mm-hmm.
it forecloses any sort of like narrativization. It's like, for Lacanian terms, it's so caught in the imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if,
Well, I
like,
mean, I
this is
think
the
there's
point of the
several.
narrative, the symbolic act or the narrative thing that he's kind of like foreshadowing with like his later text.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you read Libidinal Economy by Lyotard, this is his famously evil, quote unquote, evil book. And this whole theory of libidinal transfiguration of the perfect community is denied by Lyotard as what does he call this? The dream of little girl Marx. It's like there's old man Marx, and I think it's little girl Marx, something like that. In other words, uh, he I think, develops, it's been a while since I've read Libidinal Economy. He develops a conception of an entropic theory of death drive, which prevents this blissful theory of libidinal transfiguration as a kind of naivete. So there's a certain nihilism in Lyotard. There's a move, the primary polemic in Lyotard is that um, is against totality, right? Lyotard is one of, even more than Deleuze and Guattari, is very much in favor of a move away from the Marxist theory of the proletariat as grounded in class, grounded in the working class, right? So Lyotard himself is, I mean, it's very ironic that he wrote that book on postmodernism, which apparently I learned recently was like never intended to be a systematic book. It's like something that he wrote, like I think like in a weekend or something like that. And then it became the emblem of something that he never intended for it to be, like the statement about what postmodernism is. But again, according to Jameson, the main polemic, and I think that Lyotard's interesting because he is very much a literary critic. He is very much an anti-Marxist in his own way, and there's a lot in his work that's quite compelling. I mean, he's introduced me to certain things about Kant's critique of judgment that are of extreme interest, and I think Jameson also, because when we think about totality, we have to think about Kant's category of the sublime and representation. And here, Lyotard introduces Jameson to a lot of thinking in that domain, but not in this text. In this text, I don't know how much of a critic he really is. Matilda.
I think it's hard to get a grip on this introduction because it's like 100 pages, and he kind of I really liked it. I thought I found it all very fascinating, but it's kind of hard to judge because I feel like the proof will be in the pudding, and the analysis of the text, he kind of like delays the ability to really like test what it all means until later. However, I have found it all interesting, and I felt like Max Weber. I liked how he kind of was using Max Weber and thinking a few things, like the emergence of the possibility of psychoanalysis. I just didn't expect that to be there. I mean, it's kind of a splattering of many things. And so I guess, I mean, I was kind of frustrated with like his discussion of Lukács and Althusser. I found to maybe not to be so accurate in certain ways. Like, he makes Lukács and Althusser like meet by saying that they both agree with Hegel, actually, because Hegel is against immediacy, and kind of like is, and I mean, Hegel's certainly against immediacy and his like attacks on intuition with Schelling and stuff, and I think Lukács is very good on that point, but I don't know if it's so much what Althusser's, at least in For Marx, is so focused on. And I like, there was other small things that were like, when he said that like Althusser's real attack was on Stalin, when like Hegel was code for Stalin. And I feel like with regard to For Marx, like the entire book is about Hegel and how Hegel's stuck in the problematic of humanism. And he really doesn't like I feel like represent the arguments of for Marx very well. You know, I don't know if that's where he's really coming from when he's talking about Althusser. I mean, I assume it's a part of it. I've only read that of Althusser, so I don't really know how to judge that. But I found it kind of superficial in certain ways. Like I'm fine to go along with it, and I think like maybe it's not so important. But it did make me wonder if he has, if he's maybe not like if he doesn't accept the criticism of humanism that like Althusser provides and doesn't really like accord himself to that anti-humanism. And I think.
I think he definitely does on the latter point you made, in the sense that he's constantly concerned in his conception of political unconscious to eschew any commitment to the determination of the text vis-a-vis some phenomenological analysis. So it's definitely like a move away from phenomenology, and we'll see that when we analyze some of these texts in like Conrad, and even in his analysis of Balzac as well. I think we get the sense that even the typological characters that are always sort of like stand-ins for some point of a master narrative tied into a class formation or something like that. So I'm not sure, but I do think that he's also quite explicit that we can use the best of these traditions in such a way where perhaps what we would normally see as an antagonistic or contradictory point of synthesizing them for this wider effort of literary criticism they can be thought together in a certain way. I think the biggest challenge that I have with that, Matilda, is around how he's trying to say that even Deleuze and Guattari are thinking totality, for example. Do you remember that section?
Yeah.
That was very strange to me, and it felt as if Jameson was giving into politically correct fads of academia, wanting to make them dialogue with each other, when in fact their constitutive intellectual foundation is so anathema to one another, right? And so that felt forced,
Sure.
frankly. Yeah.
I'd like to make one last, like, kind of overall point about this introductory essay is the theme of like the very like ecumenical theme of like trying to bring all of the tendencies into one group and kind of bring people back into the fold. And it seems like Marxism is like the horizon in which these like interpretive techniques can be employed. And it's like, it's almost like they can remain within their little interpretive realms doing their work as long as they somehow recognize. I don't even know exactly what they have to recognize. I mean, maybe once we finish this introduction, we can ask that question of like what it is of Marxism that has to be recognized by these various tendencies. But what is very clear is that, and it leads you to ask like, I mean, and perhaps it's obvious that like there is this like descent or this like fragmentation of the left into these various tendencies, and like the breakdown of political Marxism. It almost feels like he's trying to reconstitute some sort of Marxist collective within the academy and hoping it will spill out of the academy in some way. And
Yeah.
through the various like feminism and psychoanalysis and different liberation struggles, like trying to connect them all.
Yeah, or maybe you could say have Marxism serve as the sort of dignified pole or the kind of originary point where all other traditions can kind of pluralistically coexist with Marxism, but Marxism might have the last word. In a sense, he's using a configuration of disciplines, of disciplinarity, in an Althusserian mode as we call semi-autonomous, right? Which is exactly, I think, a valid criticism of Althusser's conception of social formations, which is that it ultimately results in a kind of relativism. Now, I say that doesn't mean that we must resurrect some economic mechanistic determinism, because I think one of the things that this text invites us to ask, which is that sweet spot between expressive causality and structural causality, is something deeply productive. And I think it's that point that Jameson is trying to work in, right? That I think is extremely interesting. What I find less interesting is this kind of American, maybe we could call it even a latent pragmatism of this pluralistic ecumenical approach to all of these things. And again, like Northrop Frye is kind of like when you put too much sugar in your coffee. Like you didn't need that much sugar. Maybe, right?
Well, at that point, like in his like like when he like references like the theological levels, like it makes you want like from the last meeting, and I'll stop after this. I had this like, probably misinterpreted perception that like his idea about like the theological levels of analysis was like the book, and like the main narrative was like the proletariat revolution, like orthodox Marxism, and like we like we were going to universalize Marxism away from like some workerist model into this like very like ecumenical Christianized reinterpretation of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway,
No, that's very good. And I think it dovetails with Kolia's reference to, and we'll go immediately to Akshay in a moment. Thank you for that, Matilda. To footnote number 31, if everyone can draw their attention to footnote 31. Classic Jameson style is that he's ecumenical while at the same time recognizing maybe the implicit danger in his ecumenicism, which perhaps you could perform a kind of class analysis on Jameson as like a professor, right? Which is that there's something about the intellectual as professor in late capitalism, which maybe you could say forces them into what he calls this sort of, at some point he even confesses, that not only do I have to dialogue with post-structuralism, but that our whole social reality is itself post-structuralist. I can find the page where I got the page where he references that. But just, what is the point about 31? And I'll invite Kolia maybe to comment on that after Akshay jumps in, because I think it's very, very much useful and a very interesting point also to think about footnote 31 in relationship to Jameson's wild manifesto on American utopia. And the army, by the way. Go ahead, Akshay.
I mean, I can hold off if Kolia wants to go.
Yeah, perhaps, Kolia, if you want to jump in and articulate and share a little bit about your thoughts on this question, which I think is very valid, which is this like, I once wrote an essay on Jameson called Two Ships Passing in the Night about his relationship to French theory. But that's kind of what he's getting at here, right? Which is this this fact that the French left was dealing with a socialist and communist party that was like this huge bureaucracy that was creating all kinds of headaches. And I was even reading a Lacan essay where Lacan is saying that Marxism is fully captured by the state because the French state was like publishing Marxist texts. And Lacan was trying to make a point that this is actually resulting in Marxism becoming succumb to a university discourse. And then ultimately Lacan says something very interesting, which is this is sapping dialectics from Marxism. Its connection to the university is killing its capacity to think, what he says, beyond segregation, which is a very interesting motif. Golia, would you like to jump in, my friend?
In just a minute, I think. I'll come in after Akshay.
All right, cool. Actually, please.
I mean, I would like to say that the ecumenicism is necessary and sort of like demanded, like, not just like theoretically, but kind of like by the material situation. But I mean, like, how do you put it? Like, I mean, I guess like this is like a theory of mediation, right? Like, and like the whole chapter is about narrative and interpretation. And I guess like what he is sort of introducing is like, I mean, I don't know, I guess like it's not so much as Marxism as the last word, but as literally the work of translation. And I mean, right now, like we're all like, you know, sort of passing snide judgment about Jameson's a professor, but any actual class project that we will build, like we'll have to work with the segregations that exist. So it can't just kind of go like, why are we talking like professors or workers or any other category? We have to do the work of mediation to actually like create a universal, right? Like it has to be constructed as an interpretation. And only an actual kind of synthesizing ecumenical project can do that work of mediation, right? Like, and I guess like in a different sense, like again, like as an anthropologist, I'm kind of struck by the fact that the whole chapter seems like a kind of like polemic against the concept of like culture. But on the other hand, like a lot of what anthropologists say about culture is basically kind of like smuggled in. It's like everything is culturalized, but there's no such thing as like a culture. But at the level of, you know, like that we don't simply have like any kind of political conflict that isn't inscribed in social, linguistic, historical relations. You know, it has a kind of like a context, a time and a place, and a kind of like a setting. So I don't know. I mean, I guess like it's at some point in the earlier discussion, there was this thing about like humanism and phenomenology, and I don't think it's as much phenomenology, right? Like if you look at the discussion about Levi-Strauss, Levi-Strauss is like radically anti-phenomenological. A lot of the people like took issue with him because like what he sort of did in his mythologies is he like collected hundreds and thousands of versions of the same myth from like completely different groups that may not have ever even heard of each other, right? And he's like, it's not a group consciously thinking this is what, but it's like in the very mutations of the kind of like the facts of the particular myth, like when did the jaguars steal fire from whom, what was the punishment for this? There's like these uh, largely unconscious kind of like thinking through of kind of like political problems, right? And that only becomes visible at the level of totality, right? Like when you delete individual experience and you kind of abstract from it and you sort of look at, I don't know. So I mean, I guess like what I meant to say is like I think the ecumenicism is like kind of tied to his sense of what he conceptualizes the political project as, insofar as he centers mediation.
Yeah.
And I think he's saying like the only way we can make that argument about mediation is like it is just another interpretation, but the truth is the whole, right? Like it's the in that Hegelian sense that you have to show how the error, why the error was an error, and why the error itself was kind of emergent from the material circumstances. Otherwise, you can't kind of like dissolve it, right? Like, you know.
No, that's exactly right, which dovetails very, very well with his point about Lukács's theory of reification and what's missing in it. What does he say what's missing in Lukács? I think it's a beautiful point. It's a Blockian point, which is that the alienated consciousness of modern life, Lukács has too much of an ethical relationship to it. In other words, he can't see the shards and fragments of processes of fragmentation, or in Deleuze and Guattari's sense of the becoming schizoid of social reality itself, as presenting possible moments of utopian becoming, or possible moments of, right? In other words, the acceleration of social fragmentation, okay, is preventing a conception of totality that Jameson refers to as organic. Organic. What is that? That's that conception of totality that we talked about before from Critique of Dialectical Reason as like a theory of group totality that would be like instantiated in like a material praxis, right? Like praxis as totality, right? A lived totality. No, that's what he says on page 55 at the bottom, which is that we are now in the midst of a post-structuralist culture, which means that it's now, well, it's now moved from organic to what he calls the aesthetic. Okay, so that's, I think, very useful in the quote that he brings from Sartre on page 55 to illustrate this is quite compelling as well. But I do want to go back to this thing, and I mean, I didn't mean to chide him at the level of oh, you're a professor and any kind of reductive PMC thing. I'm opposed to such formulas, but I do think that it's useful to have maybe like a kind of clear-eyed conception regarding what academic pragmatic pluralism of disciplines forfeits, perhaps. And I don't propose to present an answer to that question or that conundrum, but I just propose that it is a conundrum worth our exploration. That it is actually a worthy problem. uh, um, I don't know what more to say about that. Other than maybe, um, like here's what I'll say. If we make this distinction between forms of aesthetic totality and organic totality, perhaps what academic thought can give to us is like a greater specificity into aesthetic forms of totality and therefore of alienation. But perhaps what academic thought can give us much less so would be organic totality, right? Or sort of what is the overlap between these two domains, if you catch my drift. Might be one way for us to tether with that question.
This is one last thing I'll just say. It's like, I do remember the opening of this book. There's like a weird epigraph to Durkheim, I think.
Yeah.
For all people who just quite surprised to see. And Durkheim actually, he has this whole argument about pre-modern society is mechanically solidaristic. It's not really society, because the people are actually sort of self-sufficient, right? Like, whereas modern society has organic solidarity because you really need other people. And it's like it's an interesting argument about like when does society really exist, right? Like it's sort of when the work of mediation really exists. I mean, so I don't know. I mean, yeah. So I'll stop there.
Sure. No, 100%. And Durkheim, yeah, Durkheim does reappear. Jameson has a certain Platonism of the disciplines in his own right. And what do I mean by that? Jameson's a bit like Badiou, and I love this about Badiou, but reading Badiou has really, for a while, made me look at the history of thought in a very different way than I normally do. Which is that for Badiou, and you really get this if you read his translation of Plato's Republic, how is it possible that like Mao can appear in Plato's or in like Socrates' dialogues, but like Badiou makes that possible without it being like campy or dumb? It's obviously bound up with his very strange French epistemological tradition, but it's also this idea that thinkers interject in the history of thought something singular, a problem. They locate a specific issue. And that means that one has to sort of travel with a heavy bag, intellectually speaking. You have to have an awareness of the seminal and singular problems that thinkers give to thought, right? So in that sense, now we're looking at ecumenicism in a very different way, right? Because I think we were looking at ecumenicism in a very Marxist, sectarian way, right? Which is valid. But maybe perhaps that's actually more in line with what Jameson is actually thinking as well. which is why Weber can be included, why Northrop Frye can be included, maybe even why someone like Jung could potentially be included, even though Jung is so anathema to Freud, for example, at least at the level of he's anti-materialist, right? So perhaps that's something a bit going on. But again, that's exactly what Deleuze and Guattari were also doing, right? There's a way in which you can kind of appropriate the singular contributions of thinkers for your own project without cheapening them, right? I don't know how that sits with others, but perhaps that's what's going on here. But again, it's magisterial because of the ambition. It's an extremely ambitious project to do that with thought, with figures of thought. And in that way, it's a 180 of what academic disciplinarity is supposed to do, right? It's not specialized at all, right? So yeah, maybe that's another way to get at this, what he's doing here. Kolya, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. This will be scandalously half-baked, but to jump in on this this thing of we're kind of talking about like a bad totality in a way. And in that footnote, Jameson talks about how the French theorists are complaining about the French state as having all this outsized power. But these French theorists have this big audience in America where we've already suffered the fragmentation that some of the French theorists think they want. And we've seen that, even it's kind of interesting, back in 77, 78, it's already demonstrated to be a disaster. And so then the question is, how do we piece together, how do we slap together something convincing from all these fragments, which are theoretically and otherwise incompatible with each other? I don't have much high culture to bring into the conversation. I'm a little behind on my Flaubert myself, but someone brought up Andor. I think it was Daniel brought up Andor in the Discord. And I think, Andor, I was all in on season 1, and then something in season 2 struck me as kind of disappointing. And I think what it is that it's a very abstract effort to establish some sort of revolutionary doctrine. It's sort of saying that the only way that we can build a popular revolution, to make revolution part of the popular imagination, is to just deprive it of all specificity at all. So it's just this kind of like rebellion, which, they don't even use terms like democracy or anything. It's just a rebellion against empire. And I think that this demonstrates kind of the bad route that we can fall into if we're committed to the idea of totality, but we can't find a convincing way of navigating the actual complications of fragmentation, which I like that quote. I'm going to butcher it, but we're not just in dialogue with post-structuralism, but that is the ontological reality, basically. And how do we navigate that to put together a project? And I think that we actually can see this happening in the political organizations that are taking shape in the US, where you have either these very ideologically driven small organizations, or you have kind of big tent organizations like DSA, which make no effort to commit to some form of privileged specificity about what to do. It remains at this level of kind of a bad totality. So I don't know if that's kind of what I was just thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of like Jasper Burns' new book on the George Floyd uprising as an imagined sort of allegory of what communist revolution could be, even though it was a moment of a kind of retrenchment of bourgeois power. He ultimately argues that a future communist revolution will look more like a spontaneous insurrectionary moment that is not governed by representative channels of existing institutions, and that he kind of wants to say, as far as I understand his argument, that like there's something about social fragmentation and crisis in modern capitalism that prevents even left-wing institutions from adequately steering revolutionary energy. Now, here I think is exactly where, and hopefully I didn't lose you in this conversation about libidinal transfiguration, but this is exactly where all of that stuff comes out, right? Which is, okay, well, then what are we analyzing at the collective level of the desire? Is desire an intrinsically repressive function and source for the masses? Or is there a kind of, is there a means by which institutions could steer desire? In what sense do the masses wish for a liberation, right? These questions, I think, are posed by psychoanalysis. In some ways, one can see even in the Lacanian tradition, especially given that like the later Lacan has this idea of the dissolution of the institution, and given that so much of Lacanian psychoanalysis is actually, I think, very much in solidarity with currents that are kind of anti-normative in social life. This is why Lacan attracted the 68 movement, right? There has, and I think it's a valid question, the extent to which bad totalities on the left, as Kolya has articulated them, although that may not be a phrase that you are committed to using, because we don't want to offend that dimension of the left. Because again, this goes back to this like split dichotomy that Jameson articulates in that essay that I referenced on pleasure, right? Between, and again, I track this through the work of Christopher Lasch, back into Second International Bohemian leftism, right? Which, if you read like Eli Zaretsky, a great historian of psychoanalysis, he'll make the claim that you can actually historically locate a distinct set of demands that emerge from the literary left, the Bohemian left, that he thinks are qualified as petty bourgeois demands because they prophesy a liberated society that no longer has the interests of labor in their purview of liberation. Okay. And Eli Zaretsky says that this emerges about in the 1920s during the Second International period. And that this is almost like a historical repetition of a particular, you could say, libidinal form on the left. And if we declare it to be of a petty bourgeois structure, I think going back to Jameson's points about totality, that doesn't mean that we need to necessarily alienate that element and say that they are enemies of the revolution. But perhaps, and maybe forgive me if I'm being too ecumenical, there is a way in which there could be a rapprochement. Because Zaretsky, in his book on the history of psychoanalysis and capitalism, says that this Bohemian left invented the sphere of personal liberation way before the 60s even came about. But they were only permitted to do so on condition that they had exemption from wage labor. And so the question kind of becomes sort of like, how does that element of the left, which is that pure Wilhelm Reich, Marcuse, student, like the students are the proletariat, that proposition, right? That new left idea. Where are we at with that? Where are we at with that is my question, right? Because inevitably it drives us to this position of a debate about what is the revolutionary subject and to what extent can the revolutionary subject be reliant upon the theory of social class. And here we're then introduced to Althusser once again, I would say, in the sense that Althusser doesn't permit us really to think revolutionary subject vis-a-vis social class in a certain way, right? I'm not saying that we should think revolutionary subject purely from the position of social class, but I do think that this debate internal to the left is still very much present. Kolya, you kind of mentioned it as how it persists in the American context, but perhaps more in future sessions can be said about this split. Um, I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that division. It interests me a great deal. You know what I'm saying? Does this make sense, what I'm saying? Matilda, please.
Yeah, it does. I was thinking like of the difference between like the words like ally today and like solidarity. It seems like one is kind of perhaps could be like, I feel like allyship is like kind of this like ethical imperative that maybe retains some like private aspect of liberation and respecting other people's spaces or something. And solidarity seems more closely aligned to like some material link or connection, just as two words, just to think about. And I'm curious about Althusser because, like, I mean, just from reading for Marx, like, what I took from him was that like there's like there's Hegel, and then there's like Marx and Engels who are like who broke from humanism as an ideology and came up with the theory of instances of like the different spheres of social life, and they didn't really complete that theory of ideology. And like Althusser is saying that like even the idea of when investigating like a revolutionary conjuncture, like you can't say what it is before you investigate it. Not that the subject of like, and maybe it's like once you investigate it, it's likely that like the economic is the most determining factor, and therefore like the subject of history is predominantly an economic one. But it's not to say that there is no, like that the proletariat is no longer the subject of history. I took, the lesson I took was that like it's dogmatic and unscientific to assume, like Engels does, that there is a hierarchy of the different instances and spheres that's predetermined. And his point is just more of a scientific point that you can't, you don't have a scientific concept if it's predetermined. And so in investigating it, you will come to know what the hierarchy of the spheres are. And so you'll understand how to intervene in a conjuncture. But we all know that it's likely to be an economic one today. Or maybe, or in his time, who knows what it is today, but like, you know, I would assume that the weight is towards the economic rather than the, I don't know, the philosophical sphere or something.
Well, no, the question was premised on, in Stalinism, the fact that the Cultural Revolution was foreclosed, was stalled, because that itself had something to do actually with class, but in the other way than you might think, which is the bureaucratic class of the Stalinist technocrats themselves. If they were to experience cultural revolution, it would destabilize their class position and things of that nature. On the one hand, on the other hand, I would say the whole moment of the 60s was itself a global moment of the concentration of the problem of cultural revolution, which of course is concentrated in the Chinese case. But really, we would have to ask ourselves, this is why, by the way, this book that's very important to me, that has helped me navigate the distinction between proletarian and bourgeois revolution in Marxism by Kluge and Necht on the notion of the public sphere, has really, really clarified this, because you have to go back and you have to study the debates of the Bolsheviks on the meaning of cultural revolution, I think. And Trotsky is one of the best thinkers in this domain, and so is Lenin too. So I think, Matilda, that's one way to get at this problem. But what we know is that in this post-structuralist cultural landscape, yeah, it, I think to some extent we have to ask mediation, totality, but also the limits of this kind of pluralistic model, because in a certain sense, the question about the pluralism of disciplinarity, I think what we lose there is also the problem internal to the disciplines of points of negation, determination, and antagonism as well. Like, so there's a lot to that. Um, Although sometimes history has a natural way to shift the disciplines. Like, for example, there is, I think, even if you look at like the evolution of like historical materialism as a Marxist conference, there is a certain way in which the defeats of the left and the crisis of liberalism has in a way made what you might call more orthodox forms of Marxism more inevitable within the ecosystem of academic Marxism. And I take that as an interesting, almost like organic phenomenon. Andrew, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is really good stuff. I mean, this is a very dense theoretical text, and I'm really liking it. And it's bringing up a lot of things. Like, I know you mentioned, the polemics that Jameson's having, and you could see, like, in his works that he's combating against a lot of post-structuralism and post-structuralist influenced thought. And I think, like, correct me if I'm wrong. Again, I'm just spitballing. Like, it seems like one way to also think of like this, possibility of narrative, which can't be, what was it? You can't. It's not a representation as like Darstellung, right? Or is it Vorstellung? I forget the difference between the two German terms, but like, he's saying that what is politically unconscious, this narrativization can't be put in representation, and
Right.
it makes me question like how much, like, is this also a response to Derrida's famous term of "there's nothing outside the text"? Because, like,
Yeah.
is there nothing really outside the text? Because, like, if texts
Yeah.
relate to other texts, then what's there is something similar to like the signifier, right, in Lacan, where like we end up in a Russell's paradox.
Yeah.
And I think for Lacan, that's the failure of the signifier, and that's why he resorts to topology. But that's the digression. My point is like, I feel like when you look at like today, workers and those that are not in the university or could not make it, it's not to say that they're like foreclosed from academia, because the way that the internet works, like including someone like myself who's never stepped foot in the university, but I joined the military and somehow got into philosophy. It doesn't mean that, like, I have the sort of consciousness of someone who is a university student. Not to say that they're not proletarianized. We had this conversation in another group. I think it was one of the con groups where we're talking about like the position of the student. But like, even if I were to become someone in the university, I can't deny the unary trait that marks me of being working class and coming from a gang related background, growing up in the hood, etc. And at the same time, like, the way that sort of narratives, social bonds, codes touch people in, like, different ways from different class positions, it seems like it's not necessarily within a textual framework of like an actual physical text, but in the way that something is trying to inscribe itself. And I think this is like maybe related to this idea of cognitive mapping. I know you mentioned that's more along the lines of a conspiracy, but it's like the working class or just groups of people in fragmentation that are trying to collaborate in social bonds are trying to like inscribe some type of narrative. I feel like Jameson is kind of bringing a new type of framework of, semiotics, a symbolic narrativization in ways that like are solidifying the Marxist project of thinking about class, but at the same time not getting lost in this multiplicity of like populism or groups in a Deleuzian sense. So I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing, but it's
Yeah.
things I'm thinking about, like in the ways in which like we look at it now, like many working class people, many people that are veterans and came from working class backgrounds are getting into theory and have never stepped foot in university, or workers with earbuds that are like listening to intellectual podcasts that are like, oh, now I could transform my consciousness. But you know, I guess you hear what I'm saying. Like they're able to collab in different groups because of the internet and all the way that information, you know, is kind of expanding itself. But like this problem of narrativizing, I think, is key in how that operates, whether within the text or outside the text, but symbolically, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think it's good when you think about class and logic of what we call organic totalities, and these opening remarks I tried to make about, Sartre and Lukács is really compelling in the sense that it's because like, I was reading this book on Lyshenko, the proletarian science. They had this idea of proletarian science, and it's like this insane sort of like group epistemology that the Stalinist kind of like in a sense, like they created like an episteme based on this like mechanistic theory of class. And Lecourt, the author of this book on Lyshenko, it's called The Case of Lyshenko. He says that uh, this epistemology that they created inevitably had to produce a charlatan of the stature of Lyshenko. It could have been anyone. It was necessary because ultimately they had this like extremely vulgar conception of the proletariat, which was not mapped onto the active like forms of capitalist social life in a certain way. It's like deeply like this flaw of like this. So I'm very sensitive to that, while at the same time recognizing that the hallmark of bourgeois ideology is the rejection of class antagonism. So it puts you in a certain conundrum as a Marxist, because you possess at a libidinal level that knowledge of class reality, right? While at the same time you have a historical sensibility as to the limits of actualizing that in a form which would be either mired in some kind of like class resentment, or put forward in some kind of like mechanistic reductive Stalinist mode. You see my point? And that's the beautiful dance of being a Marxist, I feel, and that's actually why you see Jameson too, having to make this dance with post-structuralism, right? And that again is something that like Catherine Liu and a lot of and Chibber refuse to do. And they, in a weird way, even though they're not Stalinists, what do? They just ignore post-structuralism. They just don't even like dance with it. And that's a problem because intellectually it's extremely rich. It's worth playing with, Akshay, please.
Yeah, how do you put it? Like, I'm intrigued by your question about like critiques of pluralism, but I guess like I kind of see Jameson assuming, and I'm kind of convinced by the assumption that like I mean, just like a materialism of narrative and of like class consciousness, like sort of necessitates like a minimal degree of pluralism. And like kind of in so much as like when you were talking about like 68 and I mean, I was thinking about the student protests and like Palestine, right? Like in the US, and like thinking about I mean, like I think the allusion to the 18th Brumaire is something to the effect that in a capitalist society, you're going to have like students and workers in the sense that some people are going to work. There's going to be like social reproduction of universities and like, I mean, at the level that like each of these positions, obviously because of their material conditions, kind of impose certain limitations on what they can do. Like, I mean, they are sort of like determinately constrained in certain ways. But it's, you know what I mean? Like you can't just be like, oh, okay, pretend that isn't true. But like the collective subject has to be kind of like, has to build on top of that, right? Like not kind of like it would be a sort of utopian claim to be like, okay, so what kind of universal subject can we kind of But the universal subject doesn't exist, right? Like what the universal subject has to be created through the collaboration of these like kind of the agents that populate like the 18th room edge. Like, I mean, in the sense that like that line of class antagonism is, I think, has to be precisely constructed through politics and is constantly threatened by reaction, right? Like in that sense that, of course, and you're not going to get out of that, right? Like, I don't know. So I mean, maybe that's just like endlessly narrative and culturalizing, but I don't know how you can offer
Yeah.
a different description of human reality. Like,
No, I think that's actually the Rancierian point of the this neologism he creates of the political as the conception of the almost close to Hegel, right? Which is this idea of the competing interpretations over wrong. And I feel like today, in a sense, because of systems of technological mediation and immediacy, we have a kind of remove from the organic instantiation of communities that are wronged. There's like a distance of the possibility of an even like Nancy, Jean-Luc Nancy talks a lot about this, about the incapacity of late capitalism for the sharing of mutual sensibility across communities. So I do think, and Jameson, by the way, whenever he talks about the political, what is one of the watchwords that Jameson also introduces is community. So community actually stands and collective, right, as like an extremely important focal point for the political unconscious itself, right, and for any renewed Marxism. And I would even say furthermore that this question of the political cannot be broached without a proper kind of confrontation about the segregation of communities, segregation at multiple levels: epistemology, experience, knowledge, class. Do you know what I mean? Like it's extensive, which is why I am so attracted to Lacan's theory of segregation. Like I think Lacan's theory of segregation is one of the most brilliant ideas that he invents. Connor, please.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? I'm sorry I'm late. My schedule has not been the best recently, but I would imagine you guys have already talked about the semiotic square a little bit. So I do want to talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, I just wanted to like affirm like one of the reasons that like expressive causality is like bad or a certain kind, a certain bad kind of expressive causality is that whether it's a Hegelian one that, privileges the state or a vulgar Marxism or Stalinism that affirms the means of production, what we're doing here is reducing class struggle to being oriented towards this or that at the consequence of excluding, how class conflict is operating on other levels, right? And this is also then really helpful in just really, emphasizing how theory, in doing this, is trying to orient class war or mobilize class warfare towards a certain given object or what have you, right? This happens in the academy all the time. But okay, so I just wanted to point that out because how is it then that the semiotic square is called in to sort of rectify this situation, right? First of all, I think Jameson likes the semiotic square because just now Akshay was talking about the universal subject. Tut was just talking about collectivity. And I think this is one of the reasons that Jameson likes the semiotic square, because for Graymoss, this is both something that pertains to both the subject and the collective, right? These respective narratives. And yeah, it's just like good to clarify, like, what is this square doing? Right? And if you remember, there's a moment in the reading today, like where he says a whole bunch of theory stuff, and then he goes on to say, talking about the square, now we can move on to the second stage of analysis. So there's a lot of work to do, but what is that work done in the first stage? The semiotic square is first of all registering within a narrative what is possible. what is consciously available as a resource for psychic investment, and then action. However, then there comes the second stage of this, which in Gramscian terms would be a question of manifestation, or the sort of enactment or usage of certain combinations of the square, right? And I say combinations because this is the hard part of using these squares, because it's not just one square, and sometimes it seems as though Jameson's using just one square, but that's not true. So you'll have, let's say, an economic square, which registers economic antagonism. You might have a sexual square that registers sexual antagonism, and etc. And it's with combining certain squares that activity becomes possible, right? This thing gets into a question of hierarchy, because what squares get mobilized is exactly this registration of certain hierarchies within these narratives being privileged, right? Which is nothing other than saying, at certain times the economic situation is privileged as opposed to something else, right? But this is very nice then, because it's sort of an expressive causality, while at the same time maintaining the autonomy of these respective levels or respective squares, right? And they're all interrelated and connected to one another. So certain combinations make themselves manifest and felt, while others do not. But all of these things are available psychically. They're all available consciously, right? And that might just be what is the political unconscious, right? And yeah, it might be, just to sort of summarize, for a long time I was wondering, what is the cover of this? What is this? Right? And it's just the combination of squares.
Exactly.
That's it.
Yeah. So my understanding of them is it's a binary logic that allows us to examine a given configuration, situation, conjuncture. So the example that he uses is Balzac in relationship to political classes of his time, and the contradictory positions of how the emplotment of the Balzacian characters are played out socially. And we remember the social refers to the sphere of social classes. Okay. So that makes sense. Like, that actually would work. So like you could take January 6th insurrection of Donald Trump's followers, and you could create a social class at this level. The question that we need to do and train ourselves in is utilize them ourselves. And I think it would be a good exercise to do so with new examples, right? New narratives, new texts, and see what we get derived from them. Because like you said, Connor, yeah, he wants to say that it's not the end point of the outcome is itself a failure of dialectical thinking, which makes dialectics possible in some ways. It's a very strange move that he makes. And again, like Matilda said, we're not yet at the stage in the text where we're really testing it, but I do want us to play around with it. And maybe we could even even Connor because Connor's going to lead a session not next time, but the one after. I would love for you to bring some Gramscian squares into the mix. You could maybe show them to us right on your camera if you're so willing. Because I feel like that's what this is called for. Because I mean, if we can do Lacan's 4 discourses, we can definitely do Gramscian squares. It's possible. We have the wherewithal. So Connor says how the possibilities of the square become manifest is the second level and a historical. So yeah, what do you mean by manifest?
Yeah, by manifest, I just mean these are no longer possibilities, but like being enacted.
Got it.
And again, this second level of analysis is where totality comes in, because basically we're moving from the respective narrative that we're analyzing, whether it's a given work of literature, into, this could have been another way. And to really understand why it had to be like this, you have to go outside of the work.
Right.
You have to go to history.
No, exactly. And I think that Evie has a nice point about how this can be thrown onto the concept of contradiction or not. Because again, and there is a nice introductory essay that I was reading of Jameson to Graymoss's thought overall that might be useful as like a way to just like get our bearings straight on getting introduced to Graymoss, because he's really not talked about much. He's kind of funny. It's kind of funny. I would argue that to the extent that he's talked about, it's like through Jameson's use of him. Which is kind of interesting because he used to be a huge sensation. Well, listen, I think we should probably break. We've been going for a nice 2 hours. This has been a good second session. We have a lot to read next time. We are moving to page, just as a heads up. Yeah, 127. So, and Conrad will be back. So wait a second. So magical narratives, Connor, you're not going to go next time. You're going to go the time after.
Yeah.
But the time after is also on magical narratives. So we'll have to split that section in two. All right. All right. That'll work. All right. Okay. All right. Good. Well, this is good. We're off to a good start. Thanks, everybody. Talk soon. Peace out.